Well, let's go straight on to Cadbury then. So you joined Cadbury as part of its work on corporate responsibility. Cadbury, great old company,
Yep.
saying like 180 years old by the time you joined it, with a tradition of social responsibility in some way, shape or form from its very earliest days. How did you find it when you got there? I mean, I say it had this long, fantastic history, but of course what it looks like in the modern era doesn't necessarily always reflect that. What sort of a company was it when you joined?
I mean, I was quite fortunate in that as I joined, the company became quite successful and actually had sort of was making the numbers, making the targets. So that Todd Stitzer, the CEO, was then freed almost, because he'd sort of proved the numbers with the city. He could then almost do the things that were important to him personally. And one of them was it was then called CSR, but it's really, and there'd always been a community program. There's always, as we know, right, even back to the founders of Cadbury with the back in Birmingham with the houses they built and the cricket pitches and everything. So it goes right back, but really taking that to the modern day and really beginning to look at supply chains and understand more about our accountability in our commodities as opposed to the nearness of the communities in the factories.
And I suppose it's easy to imagine that lots more people know this history than actually do. But of course, Cadbury was famous, founded by one of the great Quaker sort of business families of that period. And George Cadbury built Bourneville for workers as a place where, in a world where there was lots of poverty and no social services, would provide good conditions and cultural background for workers and all of these sorts of things that of course are ancient history now, but they were amongst the earliest examples of socially responsible business. But then of course you've got a modern business and it's operating in against modern business rules and so on. So it's easy to look back at that and say, oh, there's all these years of tradition, but of course it's changed so many times since then.
And they were also one of the Cadbury brothers was a part of the anti-slavery movement and was a founder of Anti-Slavery International. So there was so much in the DNA of the business that, and almost it's quite humbling, because I think sometimes we think the things we're doing now are new, but actually we're just perhaps going back to things we've forgotten or, things that really are quite inherent in how business operates, but perhaps we've lost in our commerciality.
Yes.
So, it's quite interesting to see. I can't actually think anything that we did at Cadbury was really new. It's just that it was done in a new way. So whether it's human rights, whether it's how you look after your employees, whether it's about balanced diet, every home built in the Bourneville campus had a fruit tree to encourage people to sort of eat healthily.
Yes.
So everything we were doing seemed to sort of go back into this sort of time before, which is quite interesting.
Swimming against the tide, that last one though, of course, isn't it? I remember going to countless meetings at Cadbury when I was a business executive.
There was always chocolate.
Big trays of chocolate, little mini chocolates there. I think some of my colleagues from business and acuity would hoover them up at the end of meetings. And stuff.
We were quite generous with them.
And in terms of the issues, I mean, so we've touched on child labour a few times. What then, having gone to Cadbury, having had that exciting interview with Paxman and thinking, well, yes, it's not good enough, is it? How did that then follow you into what you were doing at Cadbury and what you were able to do at Cadbury?
Yeah, so there was a small team of us really, and actually beginning to understand the cocoa supply chain. So now, I mean, I think if you look on Twitter or LinkedIn, business does, there's a lot of business people go to Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire or go into the cotton communities. But then actually it was quite unusual, apart from the sourcing, the hardcore sourcing guys, not many people had actually been right out to a cocoa community and actually spent time understanding what was going on in that supply chain. So it was quite... And, we were really some of the first people outside of that sourcing team to go and understand what was happening. And I think we forget that that's actually, now I think we perhaps almost overdo it, don't we, in the visits. But then it was that first understanding of how the supply chain operates. I think a real sense of, Ghana was such an important source of cocoa beans, and these were the people that were growing them. So we had a massive accountability.
Yes.
As part of that.
So let's just unpick this slightly then. So why did Cadbury get the bulk of its cocoa from Ghana? What was the reason for that decision?
So Ghana is part of the Commonwealth. So and the Cadbury brothers actually set up quite a lot of the cocoa growing there. So even when I was going back to the village, you could see these beautiful ledgers that were written, and clearly they had been you could see the stamp of Cadbury, and quite a lot of halls were called and it was Fry as well, Cadbury Fry. So you could see it at a village level. So quite a lot of the, if you talk to the sort of elders in the village, they would remember Cadbury Fry.
Yes.
So there was this sort of deep history in Ghana as well, which was there.
Yes. And what did you learn about the cocoa supply chain because you went out to visit some of the farmers while you were at Cadbury? What did you learn about them and that process through those visits that surprised you, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing was, I think at Cadbury we were quite philanthropic, and I do remember I visited sort of different types of communities. So I went to an international cocoa initiative, the community that had been looking particularly at child labour, and there it was only about child labour. It wasn't about the other economic and social factors that create child labour. I then went and visited a library we had built and filled with books, which sounds great, doesn't it? And my team, we collected the books and sent them to Ghana, and then there was a boy reading about cricket in Surrey or something, and I just thought, and then I went to a Fairtrade village and met this amazing woman who was part of the women's association, a Fairtrade association, and they basically said, we want cocoa on fairer terms. We want more fair trade cocoa because it will help our community. And when they had their own money to spend, they bought a toilet block. And that for me was another moment of, right, okay, so we come in and do what we think a community needs. And we give, I mean, the library was great and the books were great. Reading is great. When you get
reading about cricket in the Surrey is arguably lower down on the Maslow hierarchy of needs than a toilet.
Exactly.
Possibly, or
so for me, that was a real moment of,
yes.
Right. So this is something I've really taken through into the work I do today. This is not about coming and doing something to a group of people. It's about being an enabler for communities to thrive. And it's not for me to determine what that community needs. It's really to give the community the power and the tools and the money that they begin to sort of thrive themselves. And even today we have in CottonConnect, we have a women's economic program that we set up 5 years ago. I let the team determine in India with Gujarati women, they're Gujarati themselves, what the program should be. Here's some money, go away and do it. And actually it's been about community needs, and it probably is slightly different to the work I would have done if I had been if I had determined it. And definitely the outcome is much more powerful. But I think that was quite an early lesson about it, I can see that we need to empower women in across agricultural communities, but let's do that in the right way, not by sort of a clumsy attempt at sort of.
And while you were there, Cadbury, of course, became quite high profile for having adopted Fairtrade for some of its mainstream brands, which was a push to scale for Fairtrade chocolate that dwarfed anything that had come before. What sort of practicalities were involved in doing that?
Yeah, so I led that across 7 markets, which was incredible. And I think really, again, a need to understand how trade works, how you get things done. And if we go back, these skills of, who is going to be a blocker and how do you get around that? What are the practical blockers and the impractical blockers of this? Sugar tended to be, because you had to have fair trade sugar in the bars, so that tended to be, but the sugar trade is quite controlled, so that was quite a moment. So we developed fair trade sugar from Swaziland for our South African bar. We had to do a mass balance in Australia because of the way that the sugar operates in Australia. So it was really about understanding trade, but then understanding people and how you really, and back to this earlier conversation, this initial blocking perhaps for some people, and how you take people through that curve to get them to change or to do something differently to the way they're
If you
working.
look back on your time in Cadbury and identified what was the work you did there that was most successful at making a lasting impact, would it be that Fairtrade work, or was there anything else?
Well, also at the same time, there was an investment into cocoa sustainability called the Cadbury Cocoa Partnership, and which was £45 million over 10 years. When we were bought by Kraft and then Kraft became Mondelez, it was clear that this was a flagship program. I was then a consultant to Mondelez, and actually was part of the group that took that into Cocoa Life. So working again with a group, it became I think a $400 million investment into Cocoa Life. And for me, I think that, and also there was a moment of, we were all really proud of our work at Cocoa and the Cocoa Partnership and Fairtrade, but the world had changed, and actually what we wanted was sustainability and a future for these cocoa communities. So to be honest, it doesn't matter whether it's called the Cocoa Partnership or Cocoa Life. What's important is that those actions continue. But it was quite difficult because I sort of there was a moment where I had to say, okay, that was something I did I'm really proud of, but I'm going to have to put that aside if I'm going to move forward and let this thrive under new leadership and let others take this forward.
Yes.
And I mean, the Cocoa Life programme and Mondelez, I believe, is still agenda setting, transforming, and the work they're just doing on deforestation again is setting the sector. But there was that moment of, I've got to sort of let this sing for somebody else now.
Yes.
Which was really hard actually on a personal level, you can imagine.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I guess it's part of the process of making something sustainable, though, isn't it?
Yes.
That ultimately, if you create something and have set it onto such a good footing that it can continue to work without you, then that's ultimately your best job.
Yes.
If you are so central to it that but the moment you step away it falls over, then
Of course.
Okay, it had a brief moment of glory, but that's the difference between sustainable business and an unsustainable one. In some ways, you've got to have the systems. And then you eventually left, and there are a few interim things that you did. But then you went to CottonConnect.
Here I am.
As the chief executive of this social enterprise. It's not a charity, is that right?
That's right, yep.
So tell me a bit about CottonConnect then. What is its purpose? How does it make its money?
Yeah, so we work right back at the farm community level and look at sustainable cottons. That's cotton with less pesticide use, less water use, improvement in income for farmers. And then the connect bit is that we join that cotton into the supply chain, so it just doesn't sit as a some sort of cotton that has better attributes. It is actually then linked into supply chains and becomes part of improving supply chains as well.
So what does that mean? How does that work?
So practical, so one of our piece of work with Primark, we work with a group of women in Gujarat in northwest India. So they've been trained on our Real Cotton programme, and then that cotton is in 11.4 million pairs of pyjamas now.
Wow.
Yeah, I know, it's exciting, isn't it?
That is impressive scale.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I started it sort of as I was consulting between leaving Kraft and joining this role, but it took 7 years.
Yes.
And I think that's the other thing with these sort of shifts, that you start with an idea at an ETI conference actually.
This is the Ethical Trade Initiative.
And then you explore it and you really start small, but actually over time you can demonstrate to the business that this is viable.
Yes.
So we've got an enormous buy-in from the business, the Primark business, on this work. So,
I think people underestimate how impressive changes are often incremental changes. But you think, things have to happen quickly, we're on a deadline, but actually a little progress year on year, you look back within 5 to 10 years and you suddenly think, goodness me, how far we've come and what scale we've achieved.
Yeah.